The story of William Wallace has long been told as one of Scotland's greatest epics, a man who rose from relative obscurity to challenge the might of the English crown, a warrior who embodied the raw, untamed spirit of freedom. His name has been immortalized in legend, his exploits magnified by centuries of retelling, and his courage praised even by his enemies. Yet behind the heroic image lies a far darker tale, one that culminated not in the glorious blaze of battle, but in a slow, calculated execution designed to humiliate, terrorize, and annihilate both the man and the cause he represented. The way William Wallace died was not a simple matter of killing a rebel leader. It was a performance, a theatre of brutality staged by King Edward I of England, meant to terrify all of Scotland into submission. And if the stories of his death are remembered with a mixture of horror and reverence today, it is because Edward succeeded in crafting a punishment so savage that even centuries later, its cruelty still chills the blood. Capture, betrayal, and trial, the road to the scaffold. Wallace's downfall began not on the battlefield but in betrayal. For years he had eluded capture, striking English forces with guerrilla tactics, inspiring uprisings, and becoming a living symbol of resistance. After the Scottish defeat at the Battle of Falkirk in 1298, Wallace resigned his position as Guardian of Scotland, but he did not abandon the struggle. He travelled to France, sought alliances, and continued to fight in the shadows upon his return. For Edward I, the hammer of the Scots, Wallace became an obsession, the rebel who had to be crushed publicly to erase the very idea of Scottish defiance. By 1305, Wallace was a hunted man. Exhausted, cut off from powerful allies, and betrayed by the shifting loyalties of Scotland's nobility, he fell into the hands of the English. Accounts suggest that he was betrayed by a Scottish knight named John de Menteith, who handed him over to Edward's men near Glasgow. The betrayal itself added a sting to the capture. Wallace was not brought down in battle but delivered by treachery, bound in chains like a common criminal, dragged from the land he had fought for. Transported to London, Wallace's arrival was a spectacle in itself. The English wanted not only to capture him, but to break him before the eyes of the public. He was paraded through the streets, a trophy of conquest, while crowds jeered and spat at him. To the English, he was not a hero, but a traitor, a man who had dared to challenge the king's authority. To parade him like this was to strip him of dignity, to humiliate him before he even stood trial. The trial itself was little more than a formality. Held in Westminster Hall on August 23, 1305, it was staged as a grand display of royal justice. Wallace stood before a court of English lords and judges, his hands bound, his body weakened from captivity. The charges against him were read in detail, and they carried a bitter irony. He was accused of treason against Edward, of murder, of sacrilege, of arson, of spreading terror across the land. The irony was this: Wallace had never sworn allegiance to Edward. As a Scot, he owed no loyalty to the English king, yet the English court branded him a traitor, twisting the law to fit the narrative they wished to create. Wallace's defense was brief but powerful. He denied the charge of treason, declaring boldly that he had never been Edward's subject. He admitted to fighting against the English, admitted to killing in battle, but insisted that he had done so as a free man defending his homeland. In those few words, Wallace refused to let his enemies define him. They might kill his body, but they could not force him to concede to their version of the truth. It mattered little. The verdict was predetermined. Wallace was sentenced to death, and not just any death, but one of the most brutal ever conceived in medieval England. He would be hanged, drawn, and quartered. This punishment was reserved for the vilest traitors, and it was not merely about execution, it was about obliteration. Wallace was to be made into an example so gruesome that none would dare follow in his path. The sentence was as follows: he would be dragged through the streets of London, tied to a hurdle or wooden frame, his body scraping the ground as horses pulled him to the place of execution. There he would be hanged by the neck, but cut down before death claimed him, his body still alive and writhing. Then, before the eyes of the crowd, his genitals would be mutilated and burned before him, his entrails cut out, his heart torn from his chest. Only then, after this agony, would his head be severed, his body would be quartered, the parts sent to the corners of the kingdom as a warning. This was the punishment decreed for William Wallace. It was not justice but theatre, a stage set for terror, designed to display Edward's power and to obliterate the image of Scotland's greatest rebel. But even as the sentence was read, there was something chilling in Wallace's silence. Chroniclers note that he did not plead for mercy, did not cry out in fear. He accepted his fate with the same defiance that had marked his life. His words, "I could not be a traitor, for I was never his subject," hung in the air like a final declaration of independence. And it was this defiance that made his execution all the more terrifying for Edward, for a man who faced such horrors unbroken could never truly be erased. For Wallace, the trial was the beginning of the end, but for England, it was the prelude to a spectacle of cruelty that would live on in history. His execution, staged with deliberate brutality, was designed not simply to kill him, but to annihilate the very idea of him. As the day of his death approached, the city of London buzzed with anticipation. Word spread quickly, and the people flocked to see the spectacle. To them, it was entertainment as much as punishment, the death of a rebel staged as a theatre of power. Few would forget what they were about to witness. For on August 23rd, 1305, William Wallace would endure one of the most terrifying executions ever inflicted on a man. The day of execution, dragged, hung, and butchered alive. The morning of August the 23rd, 1305, dawned in London like any other, but for William Wallace, it was to be the last sunrise he would ever see. For the people of the city, it was a day of spectacle, a day when they would witness the destruction of a man who had become legend. Crowds gathered early, filling the narrow streets, their anticipation humming like a living thing. For the English crown, this was not just justice, but theatre. Wallace's death was to be a performance carefully staged to humiliate, terrify, and inspire obedience. The first act began with the dragging, bound to a hurdle, a rough wooden frame. Wallace was laid flat, his body tied tight with ropes. Horses were then harnessed to the frame, and with a jerk of the reins, they began their grim procession through the city. The frame scraped against the cobblestones, jolting his body, tearing at his skin. The streets were packed with spectators, jeering and spitting, hurling curses at the man they called traitor. Some shouted insults about Falkirk, mocking his defeat. Others demanded vengeance for English lives lost in Scotland. But to many in the crowd, Wallace was something more complicated. Even in London, his reputation had spread. They knew he had defied Edward, had risen from obscurity to strike fear into the heart of England's armies. And so, mixed in with the jeers, there was a strange fascination, even a grudging respect. They craned their necks to see him, to look upon the face of the rebel whose name had thundered across two kingdoms. The journey was long and cruel, deliberately so. Dragged for miles from the Tower to Smithfield, his body battered on the stones, Wallace was forced to endure every insult, every stare, every cheer of the mob. By the time he reached the place of execution, his flesh was torn, his body bruised, and yet he was still alive, still breathing, still defiant. Then began the second act, the hanging. A scaffold had been erected in Smithfield, tall and stark against the sky. Wallace was hauled up and fastened by the neck, left to hang as the crowd roared its approval. But this was not to be a clean death. The sentence decreed that he would not be allowed the mercy of strangulation. Before unconsciousness could claim him, before death could bring release, he was cut down. He fell to the ground, gasping, choking, the air burning in his lungs as life was forced back into him. His suffering was only beginning. The third act was mutilation. Before the eyes of the gathered crowd, Wallace was stripped naked, his body exposed not only to pain, but to shame. The executioner moved deliberately, turning the punishment into ritual. First, his genitals were cut away. thrown into a fire before him, burned as he still lived. This was not just cruelty, but symbolism, an attempt to emasculate him, to strip from him the ability to create life, to sever him from any future legacy. Then came the disemboweling. His abdomen was slit open, his entrails pulled out slowly, carefully, so the crowd could see, so Wallace could feel. Accounts speak of the executioner stoking the fire, feeding Wallace's own organs into the flames while he still drew breath. His heart, the seat of courage and defiance, was torn from his chest and cast into the fire as well. This was the heart that had dared to defy Edward, and it was destroyed before all of London. The fourth act was beheading. Only after the agony of mutilation, only after his body had been broken and humiliated, was Wallace granted the release of death. His head was severed with a single stroke, lifted high before the crowd as proof that the rebel was no more. But even this was not the end. The sentence demanded annihilation, not simply death. His body was quartered, each limb hacked away and claimed as a token of vengeance. The grisly trophies were distributed to the far reaches of England and Scotland, nailed above city gates as warnings. His head was placed on a spike on London Bridge, staring down upon all who passed, a grotesque reminder that this was the fate of those who defied the king. The brutality of the execution was unmatched, even by the standards of medieval England. It was meant not just to kill Wallace, but to obliterate him, to erase his humanity, to make his very body into a message of terror. Yet there is something remarkable in the silence of the records. Chroniclers note the details of his suffering, but little of his cries, his pleas, his screams. Some accounts suggest that Wallace endured his torment with a kind of stoic silence, refusing to give Edward the satisfaction of seeing him broken. Whether this is truth or legend, it mattered little. To his people, Wallace's death became a martyrdom, a symbol of defiance that no sword, no rope, no quartering knife could erase.
And so, on that day in Smithfield, as Wallace's mutilated remains were paraded as trophies, Edward I may have believed he had won a final victory, but in truth, he had created something far more dangerous than a living rebel. He had created a martyr whose death would echo through the centuries, a death so brutal, so terrifying, that it burned itself into the memory of a nation. The aftermath, terror, martyrdom, and the legend of Wallace. When William Wallace's quartered body was finally removed from Smithfield, the execution itself was over, but the performance had only just begun. For Edward I, the true power of Wallace's death lay not in the moment of the sword, but in what came after, in how his mutilated remains could be displayed as a warning, in how the very memory of him could be weaponized to terrify Scotland into submission. The king's orders were carried out swiftly. Wallace's head was dipped in tar to slow its decay, then carried through the streets to London Bridge, where it was mounted on a tall spike for all to see. There it leered down at travellers, merchants and noblemen entering the city, its features twisted in death, a grotesque sentinel reminding every passerby of what happened to those who defied Edward. The symbolism was clear. Wallace had once defied the king in life. Now he would serve the king in death, his head reduced to a silent proclamation of royal power. But Edward was not content with a single grisly display. Wallace's body was quartered, his limbs sent to different cities as tokens of vengeance and reminders of loyalty. One quarter was sent to Newcastle, another to Berwick, another to Perth, and another to Stirling, cities that had been centres of rebellion or strategic importance during the wars. Each fragment of Wallace's body became a warning, nailed above gates and market squares. This is the fate of traitors. The executioner's knife had turned Wallace into 4 separate messages scattered across the land, designed to make resistance unthinkable. Yet Edward miscalculated. While the immediate impact was certainly one of terror, chroniclers tell us that many Scots were cowed, fearful, hesitant to speak Wallace's name. The horror also sowed seeds of defiance. For Wallace's death was so brutal, so excessive, that it exposed not strength, but tyranny, a king who needed to mutilate a man so thoroughly, to scatter his remains like butchered meat, betrayed not just his ruthlessness, but his fear. Edward could not kill Wallace quietly, nor allow him the dignity of a warrior's death. He had to annihilate him utterly, and in doing so, he revealed how much Wallace had frightened him. Among the Scots, whispers of Wallace's courage at the scaffold began to spread. While English chroniclers emphasized his crimes and his supposed humiliation, Scottish memory preserved a different image. Wallace the martyr, enduring unspeakable suffering without yielding, dying not as a criminal, but as a patriot. Ballads and tales began to circulate, first in whispers, then in louder songs, celebrating his life and mourning his death. For every limb nailed to a gate, there was a story told in a hearth-lit hall of how Wallace had fought for freedom. The symbolism of his quartered body only deepened his legend. Far from erasing him, the dispersal of his remains across the kingdom created sacred sites of remembrance. At Stirling, where Wallace had once triumphed in battle, his severed limb became a dark relic, a reminder that freedom carried a terrible price. At Berwick and Newcastle, his remains spoke not of English dominance, but of Scottish resilience. For even in pieces, Wallace was everywhere. In London itself, his head on the bridge became infamous. Travellers spoke of it, merchants described it in letters, foreign envoys recorded it in their reports. Rather than silencing Wallace's name, it ensured that he was remembered, that his story crossed borders and generations. Even Englishmen who despised him could not help but acknowledge his defiance. The sheer savagery of his execution made him impossible to forget. The psychological impact of Wallace's death also reshaped the war itself. In the short term, Edward's campaign seemed vindicated. The rebellion had been decapitated, its greatest leader destroyed. But in the long term, Wallace's martyrdom provided a rallying cry. When Robert the Bruce eventually rose to lead Scotland, Wallace's ghost loomed large. The memory of the man who had refused to bend to Edward became a source of inspiration. His brutal death had not ended the fight, it had sanctified it. Chroniclers of the time reveal how quickly Wallace passed into legend. The English monk Matthew of Westminster wrote of his execution with grim satisfaction, detailing each stage as justice for a rebel. But the Scots carried a different torch. Blind Harry's The Wallace, written more than a century later, enshrined him in poetry as a hero of almost mythical proportions, a man whose defiance and courage transcended the cruelty of his end. Even if Harry embellished, even if he invented details, the fact remains. Wallace's memory had become untouchable, his martyrdom sealed. Edward's intent had been to terrify Scotland into silence, but in killing Wallace with such spectacle, he had given Scotland a saint of rebellion. His quartered body was meant to divide and scatter, but his story only united. His severed head was meant to silence, but it became a grim emblem of freedom. What is perhaps most chilling is how deliberate the cruelty was. This was not random violence, not the fury of a battlefield, but a calculated ritual. Every stage, the dragging, the hanging, the disemboweling, the quartering, was symbolic. It said, "Your body is ours, your future is ours, your memory is ours." Yet history has shown the irony. Edward tried to own Wallace's death, but in the end, Wallace owned Edward's legacy. The English king became remembered not as the hammer of the Scots, but as the tyrant who butchered a patriot so savagely that even centuries later, his cruelty cannot be forgotten. In this, Wallace achieved a final victory. He was meant to be erased, yet he became eternal. His death was meant to terrify, yet it inspired. His quartered body was meant to be a warning, yet it became a relic of resistance. And so, the aftermath of Wallace's execution reveals the paradox of terror. Cruelty can silence for a season, but in excess, it plants the very seeds of defiance it seeks to crush. In Wallace's case, the terror of his end was so great that it immortalized him, transforming his suffering into legend, his execution into martyrdom, and his broken body into the unbreakable spirit of a nation. The eternal terror of Wallace's death. The execution of William Wallace was meant to be the ultimate silencing. In Edward I's vision, the rebel who had haunted his campaigns for nearly a decade would be destroyed so completely that no trace of him could endure. His body would be mutilated, his memory polluted, his very name spoken only in fear. Yet the paradox of such cruelty is that it often produces the opposite of what it intends. Wallace's end was far more terrifying than a simple death because it was not meant to kill a man. It was meant to kill an idea, and in that attempt, Edward failed. The sheer brutality of Wallace's punishment lingered in the minds of all who heard of it. To imagine being dragged through the filth of a city, to feel the rope around one's neck only to be cut down before death, to watch one's own body dismembered alive, these were not punishments designed merely to end life. They were punishments designed to obliterate hope. For Wallace, the terror was not only in the physical pain, but in the awareness of what his body was being made to symbolize. His flesh had become Edward's message board, his suffering turned into a performance of royal dominance. Yet Wallace had defied Edward to the last. His insistence that he could not be a traitor, for he had never been Edward's subject, was more than a legal technicality. It was a declaration of sovereignty, spoken in the very heart of the English court. Even bound in chains, even facing unimaginable torment, he refused to submit. This refusal gave his death a terrifying duality. It was both a display of absolute royal power and a display of indestructible human defiance. The terror of Wallace's end also lies in its legacy. Generations later, the details of his execution still shock. The very phrase, hanged, drawn and quartered, has become shorthand for unspeakable cruelty. In Wallace's case, the punishment was applied with theatrical precision, each stage carried out in full view of the public. This deliberate cruelty forces us to confront the darkest capacity of human societies, the use of pain as spectacle, the turning of justice into theatre, the transformation of execution into entertainment. For the crowd at Smithfield, Wallace's agony was not hidden, it was performed. But Wallace's death continues to terrify not just because of its brutality, but because of what followed. Edward had meant to reduce him to nothing, yet his very attempt to erase Wallace ensured his immortality. In Scotland, he became a martyr. In legend, he became a hero larger than life. In poetry and song, he was reborn as the eternal symbol of resistance. The quartering of his body, meant to divide and scatter, instead ensured that he was remembered everywhere. His ghost haunted castles, bridges and battlefields, not as a spirit of fear, but as the embodiment of defiance. This is why Wallace's execution still resonates across centuries. It is not just a story of medieval cruelty, it is a mirror that reflects the enduring struggle between power and freedom. It shows how states use terror to enforce obedience, and how terror can backfire, creating martyrs whose deaths inspire future generations. Wallace's end was far more terrifying than the legends often tell, because it was not clean, not quick, not heroic in the traditional sense. It was a drawn-out dismantling of body and spirit, and yet, from that dismantling, something unbreakable emerged. When we think of William Wallace today, we do not see the mutilated corpse at Smithfield. We see the warrior who stood at Stirling Bridge, the leader who fought for Scotland's independence, the man who declared in court that he owed no loyalty to Edward. The image Edward sought to destroy has outlived him by centuries. That is the true terror for tyrants, that cruelty cannot erase courage, that violence cannot extinguish ideas, and that even the most brutal execution may only give birth to legend. Nearly 720 years later, Wallace's execution remains one of history's most infamous deaths. It is studied in classrooms, reenacted in stories, and remembered as one of the darkest punishments inflicted upon a human being. And yet, despite all the horror, it is not Edward's spectacle that endures, it is Wallace's defiance. The king sought to make him a warning, but instead he made him a symbol. And so we return to Smithfield, to that August day in 1305, where a man was destroyed in body but immortalized in spirit. The brutality of his execution reminds us of the depths of human cruelty, but also of the resilience of human courage. Wallace's death was terrifying, yes, but it was also transformative. His final breath became a call that echoed through history, a call that whispered to Scotland that freedom was worth any price. This is the eternal legacy of William Wallace, that no matter how brutal the execution, no matter how terrifying the punishment, the human spirit can rise beyond the scaffold, beyond the sword, beyond the quartering block. His body may have been torn apart, but his story remains whole, and in that he achieved the victory Edward feared most. Until next time, Vale, farewell.